this morning. It's my pleasure to moderate this esteemed panel. And what I'd like to do is introduce one by one each member briefly, give you a little bit of their background, and most of you know them, and then let them come up and say a few words, and then we'll take questions from the audience if that's okay with everyone. So first up, we have Frank Bernardino from Anfield Consulting. As you know, Frank's a member of the consulting firm. It's a boutique water resources and environmental consulting company. He's had nearly 30 years of experience working on water and natural resource management. He's also well recognized as one of the most effective lobbyists. In December of 2004, he was presented with the Florida Senate's prestigious Medallion of Excellence Award by President Ken Pruitt. So this morning, I hope you'll help me in welcoming Frank. And Frank, please come up and give us a little bit of what you'd like to say.
Is there a clicker for the slides?
Great.
Oh, it's over there. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to the AIF for inviting me to participate in the conference today. I don't get as many invitations these days because sometimes I have a tendency to get myself in trouble with what I say. So let's see if I get invited back next year. When we talked about the panel and we were getting ready for today's presentation, everybody says, well, we've talked about Amendment 1 in the past, and what can we say that's new and refreshing? And what we thought would be worthwhile to do with you this morning is to take you a little bit back as to why Amendment 1 came about. And as we know, it was the Water and Land Amendment, and I'm going to talk about the water component. Oftentimes, we tend to focus on land acquisition, and some of the other panel members are going to talk about that, but I want to focus on water. And the main reason why Amendment 1 came about, I think, is because of an earnest desire by all the professionals that work in the field to say, we've got a problem, and we need to do something about it. And so hopefully I'll be able to shed a little light on where we are. One of the most eloquent people in the state on the issue of water, as we all know, is Commissioner Adam Putnam. He's been a keynote speaker at this event several times. And what Commissioner Putnam's comments always remind me of is the fact that everybody in this room and everybody who works in this policy arena knows that we have a problem. And the astonishing thing to me isn't the fact that, as somebody who's an advocate, is I don't have to go into any member's office and try to convince them that we have issues that we need to address. So why is it that from year to year we make small and incremental progress towards the goal, but we don't actually manage to get there? And it's not unique. The situation that we're talking about is not unique to the state of Florida. Everybody acknowledges that water infrastructure is a national crisis. Here's a number of different periodicals, and I'm sure that AIF will put up these presentations and you can get your hands on them. But from the AWWA's report on water infrastructure to reports that have been sent to Congress, everybody acknowledges that this is a massive challenge that our country faces. So what are we going to do about it? Well, other states around the country have begun to take aggressive steps to do something about their water infrastructure needs. And you can look at this laundry list of reports and articles from around the state. Again, the references are there, and you can pull them up. And you see that many states are stepping up to the order of billions of dollars on an annual basis to do something about it. What about the state of Florida? Well, in the case of Florida, we understand. Senator Latvala, a longtime friend, very eloquently explained the challenges that we have around the state. And so we know that it's important. We know that it's important to protect the quality of our environment in order to preserve our economy and our quality of life. And what are the principal areas that we're trying to address in policy? Well, those are impacts to our natural systems. The work that the state legislature, Chairman Boyd, has been a staunch advocate of addressing some of these issues. What we did for springs, what we've done for Everglades, what we're doing for our lakes, bays, rivers around the state. Very encouraging that we're taking bold steps in that direction. Water supply and wastewater, again, an enormous challenge that we need to address. And then last but not all, the one that people don't want to talk about, aging infrastructure. As somebody who's had the good fortune of representing local government and utilities for many years, we try to keep bringing it back to you. Aging infrastructure is an enormous challenge. well beyond the capacity of many local governments to address from a financial standpoint. So again, what are we going to do about it? Here's the challenge in Florida. One of the things that I was really excited about, and a lot of us worked to see included in Senate Bill 552 this year, is for the first time ever a requirement that EDR, Amy Baker and her gang, do an actual assessment of what the state's water infrastructure needs. We know how many prison beds we're going to need. We know how many seats we're going to need in classrooms. We know how much additional or failing transportation infrastructure we've got in the state. And the state legislature, every time, when faced with those challenges, steps up to the plate and addresses those. And we invest the proper amount of funding in the infrastructure. Well, what about the water arena? For the first time ever, Senate Bill 552 is going to require EDR to produce an annual projection for the state legislature. Now, this year, in talking to Amy, she's trying to put her office together, trying to bring the resources together to give the legislature a number, and she'll have one next year. But I'm going to jump her announcement by doing some homework of our own. We found credible sources to talk about what our state's needs are. And so what are they? We find that in the drinking water area, the American Society, actually it's a report to Congress, found that we have a $16.5 billion need in Florida over the next 20 years. In the wastewater arena, we're talking about $18.4 billion, according to American Society of Civil Engineers. We're talking about $2.8 billion in capital improvements, again, for flood control. And the thing that I always find interesting, I heard Senator Latvala say, well, the answer for people who live in flood-prone areas is they should probably live somewhere else. And that's an innovative solution, I guess. But many people aren't in a position to embrace that. Every time that the legislature does CBIRs, community-based issue requests, or asks communities, what monies do you want to help us support your water infrastructure needs, the overwhelming majority of those projects are flood control projects. And where did the principal responsibility for flood control historically lie in? The water management districts. But the water management districts these days have enormous challenges, and as they will admit in private conversations, the flood control missions have slipped down their priority list. Now they're fixing springs, they're fixing the Everglades, they're dealing with drinking water supply. And so stormwater and flood control is a serious issue that we're going to have to address. Numeric nutrient criteria. As Senator Latvala said, water quality should be one of the most important things that we tackle, and that's an expensive proposition at the state and at the local level. Continuing, we're talking about the Everglades restoration. The reason why I single that one ecological restoration program out is because it's enormously expensive. $200 million of the roughly $850 million that folks expect to get of Amendment 1 are going to go to Everglades restoration. And as we heard, Senator Negron is proposing to bond an additional $100 million. So upwards to of the third of all of the funds that are anticipated for next year for Amendment 1 could potentially go to Everglades restoration. Well, what's the state's remaining obligation? Well, for SIRP alone, we've got $4.4 billion that we're responsible for over the next 20 years. And that doesn't include other Everglades programs like restoration strategies and other things that are done in partnership with local governments. $5.6 billion for beach erosion. What drives our economy more than the beaches? It's what makes Florida, Florida. And again, we're tackling it at $30 million a year clip, but it's an enormous challenge that we have to address. And then the Whopper. Now, this number sounds ridiculous, and most people say, oh, come on. Well, it's not my number. There was a committee that the state put together, chaired by DEP and the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And the state agencies projected that Florida has approximately $3 trillion of infrastructure, which is at risk due to sea level rise. It's not us, it's the state that's making that finding. So let's take the sea level rise issue off the table, because who can wrap their heads around $1 trillion? We're talking about $48.71 billion challenge for the state of Florida over the next 20 years to deal with all of the other issues. And so what have we been doing with regard to that? Well, at the water, there's two places where you can get money for water. One is from the state, and the other one is at the water management districts. And this is not a political commentary. The numbers just speak for themselves, and it's what they are. What's happened to the ad valorem revenues at the water management districts? You know, Jack spoke earlier about $2.7 billion in recurring tax revenues that have been cut. Well, that's at the state level. He said that didn't include property taxes. This is part of the property tax relief, which we brought to the citizens of the state of Florida for good reasons, because we went into a horrible recession and we needed to help them. But how do we recover in order to address the challenge? The Water Management District's highest years of ad valorem collections was 07, 08, before the recession. And the first drop that you see between 07, 08, and 08 and 09 was due to the fact that property values dropped. 21% of the revenues went away. An additional 31% went away when the governor and the state legislature sought to provide the citizens of the state property tax relief. But the economy has recovered. In many places, property values have gone back to what they were pre-recession. But the revenues for the water management districts in terms of ad valorem collections continue to be stagnant. Let's look at this graphic set of different ways. The blue charts are actual dollars, percentages of dollars. And we see that the dollars were highest again in 07 and 08, and then they dropped. They dropped the 21% in 09, 10, and then the 31% drop in 11 and 12. The red bars are cumulative. It's the percent change in dollars collected by the water management district as compared to their highest year of collection. And so consistently, the water management districts today are having to work with approximately half of the ad valorem revenue that they had during their highest year of collection. We have an enormous challenge. Can we get there if we don't do something about their ability to potentially raise additional revenues? The state has taken proactive states. In 205, many of us that were here worked on Senate Bill 444. And that bill would have allowed for $100 million to be used on a recurring basis for 4 programs: alternative water supply, swim program, dispersed water management, among them. And what we found is that, again, when the recession hit, the bottom fell out of that barrel. And the dollars were, for the most part, eliminated. The only 2 programs that have survived over the last 10 years approximately have been the Disadvantaged Wastewater Community Program, in large part because there's a federal match to that program. And then the other one is the TMDLs, because we all know, again, as Senator Latvala highlighted, we got to do something about water quality. SWIM went away. It was removed from the statutes. The program continues to exist statutorily, but the funding for it went away in association with the Florida Protection Sustainability Trust Fund. And alternative water supply, meeting our water supply demands of the state that are going to help our economy grow, went away. The governor of the state of Florida, when he was running for re-election, pledged that he would put $50 million a year for 10 years towards this issue. Unfortunately, for the last 2 years that he's proposed funding, it's not ended up being a priority, and it's gotten 0 funding. Let's look at what has been funded. What are the dollars that the state is putting into water infrastructure needs? Well, you see again, the recession took an enormous impact, but here, this is an area where the legislature has used the discretionary dollars that Senator Latvala, through the leadership of Chairman Boyd and others, we've been able to put dollars back. And you can see that the funding is almost at what it was pre-recession. So the state legislature is being responsive with regard to the dollars that they have to spend. But again, relative to the challenge, are we talking dollar for dollar, or are we talking pennies on a dollar? Look at the percentage of the state budget that goes to water infrastructure. We have averaged 0.5% of the state's budget to water infrastructure. And this includes every program that you could possibly think of that's in the state. If you cry out a program, yell the program out. Everglades, Springs, TMDLs, any program, it's all included. Last year we had a great year. We got up almost to 0.6%. Now this number does not include federal matching dollars. If you include federal matches that are in the state budget, the number climbs to approximately 0.8%. If you include the water management district dollars, you almost get to 1%, but also you got to include their entire budget. And so, is water important? We say that it is. Everybody gets it. Why don't our spending policies seem to reflect that priority? That is what I think drove some of the people to support Amendment 1. When they saw water and land, they said, we're going to do something about water. By comparison, transportation. I love my friends in the transportation world, and many of you who work for engineering firms know that they often sit fat and happy while they're having filet mignon and dining well while you're having a sandwich in the back, because the transportation divisions of your businesses are always doing very well. Why? Well, we got an almost $10 billion infrastructure influx of funds in order to fix roads. Every time during the recession that at the federal government they talked about, let's put people back to work. What are we going to do? We're going to build roads and bridges. Well, what happened to building water plants, wastewater plants? What about dealing with aging infrastructure? Those are jobs. Those are important too. And so the message that I wanted to leave you, and Gary's going to come up and talk about the land challenge, is we have a water need in the state. We all know it. Let's do something about it.
Thank you very much, Frank. Just to keep us all on track, we're scheduled to go to until 10, and we do want to have time for some questions and answers at the end. So I'm going to be a little bit brief in the introductions here. But next up is Gary Clark, who is the Deputy Secretary for Land and Recreation with the Florida DEP. He comes to that position with a broad spectrum of experience in the past. One of the things he told me as we were coming up here earlier, that he also served on the school board at home, and I think that's a lot more of a firing line than perhaps DEP. So thank you, Gary, for being here today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
I'm not sure which is more challenging the last couple of weeks with DEP. Certainly been interesting. It's kind of interesting to be here to talk about this from the perspective of Florida Forever being the dirt guy at a water meeting, I guess would be the way I would describe this. It's also a little bit interesting when you have to have such experts in the room and you're trying to do a presentation on something that probably half the people in the room know more about than you do. And you've got Cliff Wilson here. I saw Secretary Soul here, Secretary Vineyard. I feel like I'm going to get graded before we leave here today. Also would probably defer most of my time back to Frank. That was an excellent overview of where we stand right now. And I think this is probably going to be the short component. I'm kind of the stick in the mud, if you will, here in terms of looking at the land and water needs, and looking at it from the perspective of what we've done with the Florida Forever program for the last couple of years. And I do want to highlight that. There it is, the clicker. I do want to just highlight for just a couple of minutes a few of the things that we've gone through in the Florida Forever program. Just look at some of the funding real quick and give you kind of a high-level overview. From DEP's perspective, the Land and Recreation Program, we oversee about a $370 million budget. Of that, a good portion of that is funded through the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, specifically about $215 million of that. Now, the funds that we receive through the Land Acquisition Trust Funds are then divided up mostly between the State Parks Program and the Division of State Lands. They're going for such things as FERDAP, Florida Recreation Development Assistance Program, the Florida Communities Trust Program, land management. Specifically, DSL and DRP, Division of State Lands and Division of Recreation and Parks, when you look at our allocations, about $200 million that goes into the state lands budget, I want to just share with you kind of how that's broken up. A lot of folks wonder when you start asking about how much money is being allocated for Florida Forever. Most people want to talk about land acquisition. How much is allocated for the land acquisition component of it? New purchases. And while that number may not be as large as some folks would like, I think it's important to look at how much is going toward land acquisition in general. And the biggest component that comes into the Florida Forever budget for us is debt service. And we're paying about $150 million a year of the Land Acquisition Fund is going toward debt service to service the bonds that we use to make the purchases that we've already made. This year, DAX had about a $35 million allocation in their budget, Department of Agriculture, for the Rural and Family Lands Program. DSL received a $15 million allocation that we went straight into the Florida Forever Acquisition Program. We also, for the first time in a number of years, were able to receive funding for the Florida Communities Trust Program. The FCT program, a program where we can turn and put those monies back into the local communities, and that's where we feel like they're best utilized. Also, land management, something that's usually not considered with the number of acquisitions that we've done over the years. We haven't always funded the land management component of this. So we took about $13 million in land acquisition funding in Division of State Lands this year. In the Department of Recreation and Parks side, also quite a bit of funding goes in there. About $30 million goes into our park funding, about $15 million into fixed capital outlay, about $2.5 million into greenway programs, and about $400,000 into the FERDAP. I want to focus for just a couple of minutes on the Florida Forever side of things. One of the key things to remember about Florida Forever, and I think Frank kind of pointed that out, understand this, it is a willing seller program. You have to have willing sellers to be able to participate in the program. It might be great. We may identify certain needs that are out there. We may identify things that we would like to acquire that we think would be of benefit to the natural ecosystems. Those are not always for sale. And even if they are for sale, guess what? Sometimes you can't afford them. It's a willing seller program, and we have to be reasonable with the purchases. We have to be able to buy those parcels within a certain appraised value. I went back and looked. I wanted to see back the last couple of years kind of what the funding had looked like. I think it's important that we look at how much land has been acquired through the Florida Forever program and its predecessors. Going back to 1963, Florida has been able to acquire approximately 3.9 million acres of land at a cost of around $8 billion, going back to the Preservation 2000 to P2000 program, acquisitions from 1991 to 2001 of about $1.7 million. You'll also notice the interesting part as well, the price per acre seems to go up as you go up this scale quite a bit as well. So we're paying a lot more for the land that we're purchasing. Specifically, the Florida Forever map, we call this, this is kind of the wish list, if you will. As the Florida Forever projects have been identified over the last couple of years, we kind of plotted those out, and each of these green areas represent a Florida Forever project or a Florida Forever boundary. That means there's been a parcels of land that are identified within these boundaries that we are currently evaluating. From an evaluations perspective, it's kind of a lengthy process as it goes through the Acquisition Restoration Council ranking procedures, as it goes through their vote and their scoring system. It's then put on a work plan. Our work plan then turns into the purchase list, if you will. And our agents begin dealing, negotiating, and working with folks that are on this list. All of these green areas here represent areas that we are currently working on Florida Forever projects in. So I went back and wanted to take a quick look at what we had done just in the last, maybe in the last 2 years. And in the last 2 years, we have been able to acquire and protect over 25,000 acres at a cost of around $37 million. I apologize, I didn't realize that was so small. I certainly can't read it. That's a specific list of all of the projects that we've been involved in. That's all of the acquisitions that we've done. You'll note there's a little bit of structure difference here. Some of these were fee simple purchases. One of the things we focused on over the last couple of years, one of my goals is to increase the number of conservation easements that we're able to obtain. Conservation easements, in my opinion, give us one of the best values that we have. We actually have the development rights on the property. We can control the use of that property, but the good news is that the property still stays on the tax rolls. Wow, something happened. Just over the past 20 years, the accomplishments that have been made with the Florida Forever program, just a little bit of an example of the types of lands that we've been able to protect. I added these up, and I was talking to staff when they put it together. I said, that's a lot more land than we actually have been able to acquire. One of the things is there's a lot of overlap here. If you look at the 600,000 acres of rare species habitat that we're conserving, well, some of that may be also protecting ground recharge areas. So there's quite a bit of overlap within the areas. But look at specifically the different types of habitat that we've been able to protect. Finally, I want to take a quick look at the current land ownership in the state of Florida. I think it's interesting to take a look at it from the big picture perspective. There are about 37 million acres of land in the state of Florida. That does not include about 12 million acres of sovereign submerged lands that we also have management responsibility for. But currently, about 72% of the lands in the state of Florida are in private hands. They're under private ownership. About 28% of our land mass is currently publicly owned. If you look at the breakdown of that, about 8% of that is federally owned, about 3% by local governments, and the largest component that owned by the Board of Trustees at about 9%. Got a couple of other groups in there that make up a smaller percentage. Water management areas about 6%, local districts about 1%, and then ironically FWC and DAX and a couple of other state agencies actually still own some land as well. This year in our state lands budget, we have asked for $15 million again in recurring funding for the Florida Forever program. We are also looking at about a $10 million request that's in our budget going forward for the FCT program as well. So we've got a pretty healthy list that we're working on. We've got a healthy purchase list. And from our perspective, I think that gives us kind of a good pace going forward, and hopefully we'll be able to acquire some more of these properties.
Thank you very much, Gary. Next up, we have, excuse me, Greg Munson. Most of you know Greg, who's a shareholder with the Gunster firm. He has twice held senior positions at Florida DEP, served as general counsel from 2004 to 2006, and most recently as the Deputy Secretary for Water Policy and Ecosystem Restoration. He's got a great knowledge and a depth of knowledge in these issues, and so please help me welcome Greg Munson.
Thank you. Thank you. Like my teenage son, water continues to break out as an issue. And AIF has been focused on water since that began, and I appreciate AIF inviting me to speak here today. Some of you've heard my statement about PowerPoint presentations, which is to say, I got one applause line the entire time I was Deputy Secretary, and that's when I started a speech by saying I don't have a PowerPoint, but these blow-up screens and the light off of my forehead is making me rethink the use of PowerPoints. So my apologies if those of you in the first few rows are a little blinded. I've been asked to talk to you today about kind of the legal side of Amendment 1, so I will jump right in with that. The lawsuits commenced before the ink was dry on the first year that Amendment 1 dollars were appropriated. Those lawsuits are speeding along. There's two of them. One was filed right away, and another filed a few months later. The first one by the Florida Wildlife Federation, and the second one by the Florida Defenders of the Environment. Both of these cases have been moving along with a lot of motions and lawyer stuff that I won't get into the details of because it's not that interesting. I think the key point is the first of the lawsuits recently got to a point where they've briefed motions for summary judgment, which in this case should resolve the matter. Doesn't necessarily, and it's very case dependent, but that, in the first case, that's set for hearing in December, so December 5th. So hopefully maybe early next year we'll get an opinion, maybe even in time for the legislative session. The other case is a little bit further behind, is actually undertaking some actual discovery of documents and so forth, so that timeline's a little murkier. With the case being decided, I guess the key thing to keep in mind is the main subject matter. There's a lot of issues that are being raised and decided, but the main objection that the plaintiffs have made is the use of Amendment 1 dollars primarily for agency personnel and benefits. That's been their main thing. Not so much on whether it's this kind of project or that kind of project, but a general broad-based attack on using those Amendment 1 dollars to pay agency personnel costs. And we'll talk about it, and that's what I want to get to next, is briefly hit the legal analysis that I think will inform the court. Obviously, no one knows how the case is going to turn out. And I refer to it as Amendment 1, but the important thing is it's actually now Article 10, Section 28, which doesn't roll off the tongue quite the same way. But I mention that because it is actually part of the Constitution at this point, the Florida Constitution. And as such, the first thing that courts are going to look at and should look at when deciding whether spending is constitutional or not is the actual Constitution, the plain language of the Constitution. And I'm going to read a little bit of this language. I'm not going to read the part about a lot of it about the land buying because I don't think that's in dispute. But we've been having this public dialogue or debate about Amendment 1 oftentimes to me in the absence of any discussion about what the Constitution actually provides. And I think as a lawyer that that's a pretty important part of this. And it provides for spending to finance or refinance the acquisition and improvement of land, blah, 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 together with management, restoration of natural systems, and the enhancement of public access or recreation. So that's that management and particularly restoration of natural systems is an allowed constitutional purpose. And in fact, that's exactly what the legislative parties have focused in on in their briefs before Judge Dodson in the Second Circuit. So that's the starting point for any legal analysis, is the plain language. Really, almost anything else is secondary. I think it's important to mention in this particular context, however, there's a presumption in favor of constitutionality when the legislature acts. And that's been validated by the Florida Supreme Court as recently as a decision in 2008. So those are your first two things. Everything else is outside the Constitution, the four corners of the Constitution, and potentially interesting, but not necessarily decisive. When you do look outside those four corners, you find something of a mixed bag. The sponsors point heavily to the ballot summary, not the actual language, but the language that appeared in front of the voters. And it is very similar to the language that when I did the blah, blah, blah just a moment ago, it's very similar to that. And it excises the together with management and restoration of natural systems. So their argument is essentially, well, we want to look at the intent of the voters. And if you see the intent of the voters, look at the ballot summary. It's interesting. It's still extra constitutional evidence. I think that's not a bad argument. They have another argument trying to draw in how other constitutional provisions are focused on capital outlay, and therefore this only allows capital outlay, but the analogy, it doesn't hold all the way through because the other constitutional language is in fact a little different. And there's other extra constitutional language on the other side. Some of you, I've read these pieces before till I'm blue in the face. And I'll go back to them only briefly because I want to look down the road here. But the sponsor brief submitted to the Florida Supreme Court by the Amendment 1 sponsors, I'll quote a few sections here. The legislature has complete discretion as to the allocation among the broad conservation purposes defined in the Conservation Amendment. The impact on legislative spending is limited and hardly substantial. The legislature retains complete discretion as to how to appropriate those funds dedicated to the LATF. I mean, it's replete with this language, and this is the language of the Amendment 1 sponsors. On the more controversial issue of agency personnel, the Office of Economic and Demographic Research, which was called something else when they go try to figure out what a constitutional amendment is going to cost, asked the Land and Water Legacy Committee about that very issue. May dedicated funds from the initiative be used for salaries and fixed capital outlay and non-operating expenses? And the response was, as should be obvious, government cannot undertake essential government services without employees to carry out such programs. And they go on. The proponents of the initiative see no legal reason why dedicated funds could not be used for capital outlay, operating expenses, and salaries. So, as you might guess, this language is prominent in the legislative response to the plaintiffs in this lawsuit. And just as a matter of common sense, one of my responsibilities was the Florida Coastal Office when I was at DEP. So we had people that we paid to go out and do things like do controlled burns, remove invasive species. They were managing state lands when they did that. And I don't know how you could manage state lands without people to do it. That's the point about as should be obvious. And to me, an equally obvious point, as their manager, I need to not only pay them, but I need to provide insurance, I need to provide benefits, and all those other things that are the subject of the suit. I've got a couple minutes left, and I want to look down the road because Frank did a great job of talking about water infrastructure spending, and that has been something that's been discussed, but it hasn't really been teed up in the litigation like the agency personnel has, and I want to talk about it because I think, again, so much of this discussion about what Amendment 1 covers and doesn't cover has been divorced from the language of the Constitution. And I want to bring that back in because it talks about restoration of natural systems. So once you accept that Amendment 1 dollars can be used to fund restoration of natural systems, the next logical question is, Well, what does that mean? There's a couple, to me, I'll call them gimmies under state law. Right now, if a water body is not meeting its minimum flow or level, its MFL, the Water Management District has to undertake a recovery strategy. The purpose of a recovery strategy is to restore the water body, and you're thereby preventing or resolving what was, quote unquote, significant harm to the water resource under the law. That's almost a per se restoration of a natural system. The same is true with basin management action plans, which help restore, almost by definition, impaired waters in the state. So those to me are some of the gimmies. I think there's a few other areas that are worth looking at, and this gets a little wonky, but I think it's important. There's means right now by which utilities and other water users can obtain sort of credit, if you will, for saving water or preventing harm, and these are called impact offsets or substitution credits. Briefly, an impact offset is if you reduce or eliminate a harmful impact as a result of surface water or groundwater withdrawal, you can then take that credit that you saved there and apply it, if you use reclaimed water, for example, to fill that in, so it's not off of groundwater anymore, you can then take that groundwater and use it somewhere where it's needed more. So again, now, it's not always, sometimes it's a prevention issue, but sometimes it's very much a restoration issue. The impact that you are trying to prevent or resolve or restore is an ecological one. So again, if your project is qualifying for impact offsets, Amendment $1 would, if your water infrastructure reclaimed water project is restoring a natural system, and it would seem to do that many times with an impact offset, it qualifies for Amendment 1 funding, it seems to me. The same with the substitution credit. That's a little bit murkier because a substitution credit is really, it doesn't necessarily, it might, doesn't necessarily have the same ecological component. But there are a number of water infrastructure projects that would qualify for those and could qualify for Amendment 1 funding. Again, there's a lot of other funding issues, but I'm speaking solely on Amendment 1. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up. The only other thing I was asked to talk about briefly was what are the potential legal ramifications of the Constitutional Revision Commission. I think Frank Matthews is going to talk more in detail, so I'm not going to give you a lot of background on that, other than to point out that the CRC, what is in the Constitution is subject to their recommendations, and then it goes back to the voters after they look at it. So they can revisit any or all of this, and whether they will have the intent or the desire, rather, to overturn a vote by the people is a question. But they may have some strong policy views on appropriation by constitutional amendment, which is this is another example. So anyway, there's more to come, both on the litigation side and potentially with the CRC, and then each new legislative session will, I'm sure, pose some new challenges. I hope I've given you something all to think about.
Thank you very much, Greg. And last on the panel, but certainly not least, Temperance Morgan, who's the Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy here in Florida. Under her guidance, the chapter focuses on protecting critical lands, securing fresh water, and ensuring healthy coast and sustainable cities. Temperance has also served as Director of Everglades Policy and Coordination for the South Florida Water Management District and brings a great perspective to the panel today. So Temperance, welcome. We look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. Happy to be here. The other presenters have done a great job, I think, of walking you through the gory details of the amendment and of the water and land statewide needs. So I'm actually not going to use slides, much like Greg, and I think I have the same perspective you do on that now, Greg. But at any rate, I'd just like to wrap up with some overarching comments. As a multi-generational native Floridian, I love this state. I think this state is uniquely special in a variety of ways, and particularly because of our environment and natural resources. And as many of the presenters have said, I know exactly why people want to move to Florida. And that is why we are now the third most populated state in the nation, and our population is expected to grow by another 40% by 2050. So if we want to protect this special place that we all call home, while we grow our population and our economy, an economy that's largely tied to our natural systems and environment, then it's going to require significant investments and thoughtful planning, which is, I think, a common theme you've heard from all the presenters this morning. Fortunately, as you've heard today, Amendment 1 was passed, and it will provide a dedicated funding source to meet some of these needs. However, as you've heard very clearly from the other speakers, the needs far exceed the resources available. So what does that mean, and what does it tell us? Frank kind of ended his presentation with this question, well, what are we going to do about this? And so I'll say my comments kind of fall into 4 primary categories. The first is priority setting. If our needs exceed our resources, it's really going to test our priority setting skills. And as everyone knows, the old adage, when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So we're going to have to get real clear on what the priorities are and kind of get into a bit of a triaging mode. A few water-related priorities have already been set, which is a very good thing. As most people would agree, I think water is Florida's most important environmental asset, but it's also our most pressing issue environmentally in the state of Florida. So fortunately, with the passage of Legacy Florida last year, we've locked in dedicated funding for the Everglades and Florida Springs, 2 of Florida's most important critical water resource issues. And I think dedicating funding to both of those issues was very strategic. The Everglades is a longstanding problem. We have a well-vetted, comprehensive plan to restore the Everglades. We know we're going to need long-term funding, and the Everglades affects 1/3 of our state and our population. So it makes a lot of sense to dedicate some funding to that issue. With regard to springs, springs is an incredibly important resource for us in Florida. We may have the largest concentration of freshwater springs on the planet, and we know that springs are directly connected to our aquifer. We've had long-standing problems with our springs. Thankfully, we've started to recognize that, and this year with the passage of the Springs Protection Act, we've locked in a commitment to address that. So while we're locking in commitment to address it, it makes a lot of sense to have some companion funding to address those springs issues. So again, makes a lot of sense, very strategic commitments we've made here. We think another important priority for this funding is to protect the state's existing investments. As Gary pointed out, the state's invested tremendous amount of money into buying land here in the state of Florida, but we need to manage and protect that land. Since the implementation of Amendment 1, the legislature has committed significantly more funding for land management activities on the lands the state already owns. In particular, and Gary didn't mention this, but I'll toot his horn a little bit and say that DEP is up their game with the goal of prescribed fire on 100,000 acres as a result of having additional Amendment 1 funding. And not to be outdone by DEP, Jim Carls with the Florida Forest Service last year set a record of 246,000 acres of land burn using some of these Amendment 1 fund dollars. So again, making sure we're protecting the investments that we've already made. As owners of over 55,000 acres of land ourselves at the Nature Conservancy, we recognize, and Greg just hit on this, the importance of protecting our land, and that takes staff. And that oftentimes takes in-house expertise to do the job, but it's important for us as resource managers to do the job that we've committed to do. And TNC has worked with both DEP and the Florida Forest Service and lent our staff to help ensure that we're doing fire management on those properties. Another tenet that we think, another way of setting our priorities for Amendment 1 funding is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, meaning that we should be proactive. Protection is much more cost-effective than restoration, and there's ample examples around the state of that. And Greg alluded to some of those as well. Meaning that we need to protect our drinking water supply. The economic costs for the loss of recharge are much greater than most people think. When we lose recharge, we lose stormwater management, we lose water quality treatment, we lose habitat. So it's really important to be thoughtful about where we're getting aquifer recharge and protect those areas. We need to be thoughtful about how and where we grow. We want to grow, we know growth is coming, but let's be very thoughtful about where we do that. So as we set priorities, which won't be an easy job, we also need to be flexible. We need to recognize that piecemealing dedicated funding may mean that we can't accomplish all the objectives that Frank set out. And we know that emergencies arise, and Senator Latvala mentioned a number of emergencies that have come up recently. And you want to have flexibility in your available funding to tackle those emerging issues and emergencies as they arise. So we'll set good priorities, and we'll try to be flexible, but we're going to have to also be very innovative and think outside the box. Some of these challenges are very significant, and again, our resources are limited. So we should focus on good examples of innovation, and some of those we have already been implementing include conservation easements, which several of the presenters touched on. The idea of protecting these lands without fee simple acquisition is something we're very supportive of. We, TNC, hold over 50,000 acres of conservation easements ourselves. So where we can use that tool, we think that's a great tool to use. Stewardship contracting, you may not be familiar with that, but the idea is using timber sales revenues to cover the restoration costs for a particular site. Oyster aquaculture, an idea that can provide benefits to the economy, provide water quality treatment, habitat, improve our marine systems. Alternative water supply and treatment. We have to get innovative to solve these problems. We have to think outside of the box. And we firmly believe that the business community, you all, are a great tool in that. You're some of the best innovators out there. And we're finding that the business community is growing increasingly concerned about these issues and about sustainability because it affects your bottom line and your supply chain. So we want to engage you in these conversations about how to tackle these problems and bring your innovative spirit into the mix. We also believe that market-based approaches can be a great tool where possible. Things like pay for performance, innovation grants to bring the business community in to help us think about how to solve these problems, innovative financing. And lastly, we'll set our priorities, we'll be flexible, we'll be innovative, but ultimately, we're going to need additional funding sources. And I think Frank's presentation made that point incredibly clear. Notably, water management district funding sources have been reduced, yet the demands are increasing, our population is increasing, our infrastructure is aging, and the need for flood protection, water supply, and environmental restoration is only going to increase going forward. With regards to bonding, we believe that it shouldn't be ruled out strictly for philosophical reasons. We believe that the legislature should consider the state of the budget, interest rates, and other issues when making decisions about bonding. And particularly, I'll tie this back to my earlier point, if bonding now to address the issue will save us significantly more money than waiting decades to solve that problem, it may be a good tool to use in those limited circumstances. And again, lastly, I would encourage innovative financing and leveraging of various sources of funding towards larger, more impactful incomes. And again, the senator mentioned this concept. And we're actually in the process at TNC of investigating some possibilities of doing this with some of the Gulf Deepwater Horizon oil spill funds. There's this huge influx of money, and we really need to figure out how to leverage that, how to bring all the agencies and resources together, impact investors, and deliver big outcomes for the Gulf. And with that, I will close with an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And we have a long way to go, so we're going to need to go together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Temperance. I want to all thank the panel for all of their comments today, so let's give them all another hand. For all of their comments today, so let's give them all another hand.